I work at a Montessori school, which has small classrooms of 3 to 4 children each. The classrooms are on the lower level of a church, and my responsibility is to clean them. Every night after classes, it would only take me about 2 hours to clean all of the rooms, but I also worked the closing shift at a nearby grocery store, so I wouldn't arrive at school until around 10:30 p.m. most nights. You should also know that the church shared a parking lot with an elderly care facility directly across from it. I'll admit that a lot of strange and creepy things have happened at this school, but the weirdest had to be what happened a few weeks ago. I had just finished cleaning the second room and was preparing to move all of my cleaning supplies to the third room. It was probably around 11:45 at this point, which meant I was running a little late, so I was rushing. As I crossed the hallway to the third room, I could hear loud bells ringing throughout the church upstairs. Someone rang the doorbell. Nobody had ever shown up for any of my shifts before because it was always so late, and both the school and the church had been closed hours before. I was a little nervous, so I moved slowly up the stairs and towards the door. It was one of those wooden doors with large, tinted glass windows, trying not to be noticed. I checked around the corner to see who was outside. I noticed an elderly woman, probably in her 70s or 80s, standing just outside the door. I backed away before she could see me. I decided to ignore it, assuming she had wandered off and that one of the attendants at the old people's home would pick her up. I started cleaning again, this time mopping the room's floors. But only a few minutes later I heard banging in the halls. I jumped a little then. Then I stopped listening. The banging paused for a few seconds, followed by the old lady yelling from outside. It was difficult to understand what she was saying, so I went back upstairs where I could clearly hear what she was asking for. She was looking for someone named Abby. She kept repeating her name. As I approached the door, the woman paused. I looked around the corner, and she was no longer outside the door. It was a little unsettling, but I reminded myself that someone had probably come to get her after hearing her yell. I turned around and started making my way back out of the corner of my eye. I see the old lady staring at me through the window next to the stairs. She looked me in the eyes and yelled, "Abby, help me." Her eyes were wide open, and her hair was long and gray. I ran back downstairs and locked myself in one of the classrooms. I took out my phone and called the elderly couple next door, explaining the situation and wondering if she had wandered away from them. The lady on the line informed me that everyone was present, and they would have noticed if anyone had left because they were required to check out. She stated that she would double-check with security and remain on the line just in case. While I was waiting, I heard a banging on the upstairs window, and a few seconds later, the woman on the phone described the old lady's features and asked if it was her. I said yes and mentioned that she is constantly yelling for someone named. There was a brief moment of silence, ma'am. I spoke softly back into the phone and she warned me not to approach her and to find a safe place to stay until someone could come and get her. Obviously, this only made me more terrified. I remained in the room, listening to the repeated banging on the window upstairs. Now, this was an old building, and I wasn't sure how long those windows would last if she kept banging on them. I eventually heard male voices outside, and after what sounded like a struggle, they left. I sat there for a few minutes, just reflecting on what had happened. Then I got up to finish cleaning the rooms. The entire situation felt surreal, and the fact that the old lady is in the building across from me still makes me nervous. I never found out who Abby was or why the lady tried to enter the church, but I'm glad I didn't open the door. I used to work the register at a local gas station, but I left after a series of strange events occurred while I was working overnight. But this one incident will stay with me forever. I only worked the night shift a few days per week, usually Friday and Saturday. My shifts were usually boring, and it was a game of trying to stay awake. The only thing I had to do was stock the shelves and occasionally assist customers. On road trips, I would encounter a large number of drunk people or families, as well as entire groups of friends. But for the most part, things were quiet. On this particular night, it was around 2 a.m. and I hadn't had a customer in over an hour, so I was beginning to doze off. The desk was around the corner from the entrance, and there was a bell on the door that rang whenever someone walked in, so usually falling asleep was not a big deal. I awoke after hearing the bell ring, and a few seconds later, I noticed a customer walk in. He resembled a typical 30-year-old man who would stop in for a beer or a snack. He took a short walk down each aisle, taking in everything. Now, I've worked in retail for a long time and know what it's like when someone is looking for something specific, but this man had no idea. He was simply looking at the shelves and browsing the store. This is normal during the day, but people rarely come in at 2 a.m. to browse the gas station shelves. I looked out the window to my left to see if he was filling up his car or simply passing the time. After a few minutes, he looked over at me, said thank you, and walked out. I wasn't sure what to make of that, but I assumed he stole something small and was just being himself. After a few minutes, I forgot about the situation and began to feel tired again. To pass the time, I grabbed my inventory card and began stocking the shelves. I'm not sure how long I was stocking, maybe 20 minutes before I noticed a man approaching the end of the aisle I was stocking. I was startled because I had never heard the doorbell ring before. He was dressed in dark clothing and a large hoodie. I could tell right away that something was off. The man continued down to the back of the store, and I quickly returned to behind the counter. I tried not to stare, but as he walked down the aisles, he didn't seem to be looking for anything. He was simply browsing. It occurred to me right away that this was the same guy from a short time ago, but he had changed clothes for some reason. I also realized that he probably came to check out the place before doing whatever he planned to do. I started panicking in my head. The man began to walk down the aisle closest to the counter, and I noticed something heavy in his front hoodie pocket. I made a split-second decision to speak in order to prevent further escalation. "Do you need help finding something?" He made eye contact with me, and I could tell he understood what I was trying to do. He approached the counter without saying a word. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small handgun. Then he took a small pack of gum from beside the counter and put it in front of me. He simply stated. I didn't react for a few seconds, confused and shocked by what was happening, before nervously scanning the gum. Still holding the gun, he removed $1 from his jean pocket, threw it on the counter, thanked, and walked away. I was in complete shock, trying to process what had just happened. I ended up reporting the incident to the police and calling my manager, who did not answer. There were no updates on the situation, but it kept me on edge for the final few months I worked there. I'm still not sure what happened that night or what the man's intentions were, but I'm glad I didn't find out. I work as a cybersecurity analyst for a large office company in my hometown. I had recently started my first job in the field, so I had to work the shift when no one else wanted to. Working overnight wasn't as bad as I expected, and it was peaceful. My job primarily consisted of reviewing log files to ensure that nothing suspicious occurred while the rest of the crew slept. This meant that I was usually alone in the office building for several hours. I'd fall asleep frequently because staring at a screen for hours on end in the middle of the night was difficult on my eyes, and with no one to keep me company, staying awake wasn't easy. I began setting soft alarms on my phone for every hour to ensure that I did not sleep through my entire shift. It was a typical night, and my coworker had just finished his shift at 12 and left the building. A few minutes later, I got up and started the coffee machine before walking down the main hallway to see if anyone else was still in the building. This was my usual routine, just to make myself more comfortable. I returned to my desk, set alarms on my phone, and resumed work. It was about 20 minutes later that I realized I hadn't heard the coffee machine beep, indicating that it was finished, and went to check on it. I walked down the hall to the small coffee desk and discovered that there was no coffee in the pot, and that the entire coffee machine had been turned off. I thought it was strange, but that was about it, and I simply turned it back on and returned to my desk. As soon as I sat down, I realized my phone was not where I had left it on the desk. I checked my pockets and dashed back to the coffee desk, but it was also missing. I replayed it in my head and knew for certain that I had placed it right on my desk, next to my keyboard. I started to freak out and looked around frantically. My desk was set up in the center of a large room with other desks and computers. I felt watched as I stood in the middle, knowing that someone else had to be there with me. Nervously, I called out to my friend in a shaky voice, hoping it was just him playing a silly prank on me. I waited a few seconds, but there was no response. I stood by my desk for a few seconds before hearing a soft shuffling from behind the desk in the far corner. Almost immediately after my phone alarm went off in the opposite corner of the room, my first thought was that there were probably 2 unknown strangers in the room with me. I started running for the door outside the building. I didn't hear any footsteps behind me as I walked out, but I wasn't taking any chances. I dashed across the street to a nearby gas station and called 911 from their phone to report the unknown people in our office building. The police arrived quicker than I expected and searched the building. They brought out a man after a few minutes, but I didn't recognize him. They also found my phone behind some boxes in the corner of the office. He was also found carrying a small knife in his pocket. The next day, we learned a lot more about what really happened. Apparently, the man was an old employee who had been fired shortly before I began working there. The man told the cops he was trying to scare me into leaving the building so he could reclaim his company laptop. Apparently, he obtained the information he desired from it. At least that was what he claimed. It all seems strange to me, and I'm not sure if I trusted his reasoning for breaking in, but my coworkers did mention that they remembered the guy, and he was definitely strange. I'm glad I got out of there when I did, because I don't know what would have happened if his plan hadn't worked and I stayed in the building. Toward the end of my high school career, I delivered for a well-known fast food restaurant in my town. My friends all had jobs there, but they purposefully scheduled us on different shifts to keep us from slacking off. It ruined the fun, but the money was still nice to have. Usually I don't have any interesting stories about my workdays, but this one night was an exception. It was the weekend, and I was scheduled to work until 10 o'clock. The orders were coming in steadily, so I was making deliveries one after the other, going in, picking up the bag, driving to the house, and repeating the process indefinitely. I believe I received this order around 9 a.m., but I can't be certain because I was mindlessly running deliveries at the time. I got the bag, pulled up the GPS location for the address, and began driving. Halfway through the drive, I realized I was going in a different direction than usual. I had been this way before, but there weren't many houses over here, so most orders would go in the opposite direction. I drove without thinking much about it until I noticed on the GPS that I was 1 minute away. Looking around, I couldn't think of a single place that was only a minute away. There were no houses or shops, just trees and a road. Literally nothing. Regardless, I drove until the GPS indicated I'd arrived, which was only a quarter-mile further down. I pulled off to the side and took a quick look around to see if I had missed anything. I then called the customer. The phone rang for a while before they answered it. "Hello, I drove to the address you provided, but it does not appear to be correct. Could you please confirm this address?" I inquired, hoping he had simply made a typo. He repeated the address to me, but it was identical to the one I had in my GPS. Then he said something I did not expect. "Wait, I believe I see." I looked up and down the street. There was someone waving to me. I drove up beside him, but I had a bad feeling in my stomach. I rolled down the window, and he immediately began apologizing, saying the address was difficult to find. He sometimes pointed behind him, indicating that his house was down that road. This road he was referring to resembled a half-beaten dirt walking trail that led through the forest. I smiled and said it was fine, handing him the bag through the window. He smiled back and thanked me, watching me pull back onto the road and make a U-turn. When I looked in my mirror and saw the man still standing on the side of the road, I thought how strange that was. But not even a minute into the drive, something began to feel off. My car was bumpy and leaning to the right, and it was only getting worse by the second. It began to feel dangerous to drive, so I had to pull over. I called for roadside assistance first. I wasn't sure what was wrong or if it had anything to do with that man, but, as I previously stated, I had a bad gut feeling and wasn't taking any chances. After I got off the phone with them, I got out and checked my tires. My front right tire was busted, and it was the one closest to where the man stood, so I quickly added 2 and 2 together. I looked back down the road, and in the distance I saw a figure approaching me. I quickly got into my car and locked the doors. He approached slowly, probably aware of the exact situation I was in. As the man approached, I considered whether I should risk driving on my busted tire. But, miraculously, a truck came down the road and stopped behind me. They got out and asked if I was okay. I noticed the man walking quickly back the way he came. I took this opportunity to inform the man in the truck of my suspicions, and he remained with me until the roadside assistance truck arrived, which was only a minute later. I called the cops, and I wasn't surprised to learn that the man ordered from a fake name and address. I'm not sure what he was trying to accomplish, but he had me drive all the way out on an empty road. Hidden by the forest, I suspect it was more than a robbery. When I was 17, I worked at my parents' local restaurant. We were never in a busy environment, but it was enough to get by. I worked the cash register and occasionally assisted with waiting tables and cleaning. My parents were nice enough to give me flexible hours whenever I needed them for school or whatever. Over the summer, however, I would work full 40-hour weeks, usually from the afternoon until closing. This was my second year working there, and during the last half of the summer, my parents assigned me to do the closing tasks for most nights. I'd be there for about 15 to 30 minutes after restaurant hours to count money and clean up. It wasn't difficult, but it was a small amount of extra responsibility. Anyway, this Friday night, my father and I had a busier night than usual. Except for the assistant cook, we were the only two workers there. After closing, my father assisted me for a few minutes before locking the front doors and leaving for the night. I had plans with a friend after work, so I was rushing to finish everything. I finished a few minutes after 11. I walked out the back door, which led to a small employee parking lot, but I was surprised when I saw a guy right next to my car. He was looking through my windows, as if he wanted to see what was inside. He looked over at me briefly before disappearing into the trees behind the parking lot. I didn't have enough time to get a good look at him, but the only thing I noticed was his long, unkempt, and patchy beard. He was a strange-looking guy, and I felt uneasy as I drove away. A few days had passed, and this night it was just me and the assistant cook working the closing shift. It was a weekday, so business was slow, but about 20 minutes before closing, a man walked through the door. He sat at a table and said nothing. This was one of those restaurants where you went up to the register first to order before sitting down. So, this was kind of strange. After a few minutes, I approached his table and asked if he wanted to order anything before we closed. When I saw his long, patchy beard, I recognized him as the guy from the other night. I was so caught up in my thoughts that I missed his response. I tried to tell him to leave, but I stuttered and spoke with no confidence or assertiveness. He looked me in the eyes and asked for a dark roast coffee, ignoring everything I said. I turned around and placed the order. I assumed it was all a misunderstanding, but I'm pretty sure it was just me lying to myself to make myself feel less afraid of him. He sat at the table and stared ahead until his coffee was ready. I walked over to him and reminded him that the place was closing in 10 minutes, so he needed to leave soon. Of course, he did not respond, so I stepped away. I approached the assistant cook, with whom I had never spoken before, and told him about this guy and the uneasy feelings I had toward him. He patted my shoulder and told me to get started on cleaning for him. Then he moved to the front. I watched from over the counter as he politely told the man to leave. The man got up and made a brief eye contact with me from across the restaurant before turning around and walking to the door. I watched him leave, and as he extended his arm to push the door open, a very recognizable object emerged. A gun was tucked into the back of his belt. I thanked the cook and explained everything in greater detail so he could understand my concerns. He called the cops without hesitation, and while they couldn't find the guy, he never returned to the restaurant. I'm grateful to our assistant cook, who I'll keep anonymous for his own privacy. He could have easily left for the night, leaving me to deal with my own problems, but his kindness most likely saved my life that night. Last year, I began a new job at a grocery store doing overnight stocking. This was a local chain store with about a dozen locations, but the stores weren't particularly large. Most nights, we'd have a team of 2 or 3 stockers preparing the store for the following day. I'd worked at a few stores prior to this, so I wasn't unfamiliar with the overnight stocking gig. On this particular night, I arrived at work at 10 p.m., only to discover that one of the guys had called off. So it would just be me and my manager, Yuri, for the night. Yuri was cool, but he didn't say much, which made for a boring shift. But then, an hour later, I was working in the chip aisle when Yuri suddenly appeared in front of me, looking concerned. "Is everything okay?" I asked, pulling out my earbuds. He was breathing heavily and asked if I saw anyone in the store. I declined, and he explained that he thought he saw someone walk past his aisle a minute ago, but when he went to check, there was no one there. I could tell he was nervous, but he tried to dismiss it and returned to work. After he left, I reflected on how that was the most I'd ever talked to him, which made me wonder if he saw something. I paid more attention, but the next 3 hours were uneventful, and everything faded from my mind. We stalked separate aisles and never saw each other. Around 2:00 a.m., I'd finished all of the work he'd assigned me for the night. So I went to ask him what to do next. I walked through each aisle until I reached the end of the store, then returned and double-checked every aisle, but he wasn't there. I looked in both the back warehouse and the office but couldn't find him. I assumed he was in the bathroom or taking a break in his car, so I found some work to keep me busy for 15 minutes before walking around the entire store again, looking for him. All I found was his carton in the aisle. It was a cart. I saw him with him at the start of our shift, and it appeared that he'd stocked half of the boxes, but never finished the rest. When I saw that, I became nervous. I went out the front doors and searched the parking lot for him. His vehicle was in the far back, near mine, but it was empty. I even measured the size of the structure to see if he was taking a cigarette break. It had been nearly 4 hours since I last saw him, and I became so concerned that I called the police. The police needed to contact the store director to obtain the CCTV camera codes. They then replayed the nights. I told them about the time he approached me to ask about the person he had seen, and when we rewinded, we saw someone walking through the store. They were careful, hiding, and making no noise. But yes, he was correct. Someone else was present. We watched more, and about 30 minutes after you spoke with me, this unknown man approached him and held Yuri at gunpoint. It was extremely disturbing to watch, and knowing I was only a few miles away with no idea made me feel sick. The man forced Yuri to walk, most likely threatening him to remain silent. He led him out to the back of the building, where he was pushed into a car and driven off. According to the police, it appears that the two of them knew each other and that this was a personal attack. The man was never identified, and Yuri is still missing, even though the police were certain it was a personal attack. I didn't take any chances and quit that job a few weeks later, but I don't think I'll ever get over the events of that terrifying night. In my 20s, I got a job as a storage worker at a local warehouse. It was located on the side of a highway near the town's end. To nothing, we always joked about the location and why the company's owners decided to build such a large warehouse in a remote, empty area of town, away from everything. It was probably just cheap land with easy access from the highway, but it always felt strange to be pulled into a large empty parking lot in the middle of nowhere each night. I always worked overnight shifts with one of my coworkers while remaining anonymous and calling him Tyler. Our job was to disassemble and organize the day's shipments before transporting them to their designated storage areas in the warehouse. After a few weeks, it becomes extremely repetitive. Most nights I do easy work while still half asleep. Tyler and I were the only two overnight workers, so we would spend some days working alone. This occurred during Tyler's vacation week, so I was alone at the warehouse from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. every night. It was Wednesday night, and something strange happened right away. When I arrived, a car was parked in the far corner of this large, empty parking lot. Its lights were turned off, and no one appeared to be around it. But being all the way out here on private property was very suspicious. I parked near the entrance door and went inside before calling the cops to come down and have a look. I assumed it was just some teenagers or a broken-down car from the highway, but it was on private property and parked in the far corner, which gave me a strange feeling. 20 minutes later, cops arrived at the front door and informed me that the car was empty, with no sign of anyone. They were pretty sure it was broken down too, so we called a tow truck to come down and take it away. And then I went back to work. I moved several shipments, which probably took me about an hour, before being interrupted by a loud bang at the entrance to the building. I quickly walked down, turned on the front lights, and then approached the door. A man stood behind the glass, staring at me with his fist on the door, and he appeared very tired and exhausted. I moved closer and spoke through the glass. "Are you okay? What are you doing here? This is private property." The man stared at me with disgust. "Where is my car?" he yelled, pounding on the door. I tried to explain, but he kept interrupting me and becoming increasingly aggressive, screaming at me to let him inside the building. I threatened to call the cops on him, which finally got him to quiet down. He backed up and gave me another crazy look before walking away. As I returned to work, I couldn't stop thinking about where that man might have been. All this time, I assumed he went to a gas station to get a canister for his car, but he couldn't have walked all the way there and back, and if he had gotten a ride, he would have arrived back before the car was towed. I couldn't think of where the man could have been. That would only make sense after a few minutes of working again. Another bang echoed from the front door. I was frustrated and scared, but when I looked through the glass, I didn't expect to see the same cops who had been here before. They stated that they received a call from the tow company regarding some concerning items on the outside of the trunk that I assume no one noticed beforehand. They questioned me about everything I saw, and I told them about the man who had stopped by looking for his car. They left soon after, and I didn't get any real updates until later in the week, when the cops returned with search dogs to search the forest surrounding the warehouse. They said they found dried blood on the back of the bumper, and when they got a warrant to search it, they discovered even more blood inside the trunk. They believe the man may have come out to bury a body in the forest near the warehouse, but they have never discovered any significant evidence. However, the man never returned to claim his car from the tow company, and he never appeared again. He just vanished. It's terrifying to realize how close I was to a possible murderer. And for the last couple of years working at the warehouse, I'd get extremely creeped out when working nights alone. I knew it wasn't likely, but the possibility of the man returning and attempting to make me pay for what I had done lingered in my mind. I was doing DoorDash late one night to earn some extra cash for savings. It wasn't too busy, but I was getting a few orders here and there, which made it worthwhile. A little after 1 a.m., an order arrived for a customer 30 minutes away. It was a long drive, but the compensation was sufficient for me to accept it. I drove to the restaurant, a local Korean establishment that appeared to be expensive, and then began my journey home. By the end of the route, it was taking me through a bad part of town. I'd been here before and had no problems, but as I drove through and saw all the dilapidated houses, I became uncomfortable. When I arrived at the address, I parked along the side of the road. The house was very small and old, with a cracked and destroyed driveway. I got out of my car and started walking up to the porch, carrying the bag. My phone rang just as I was about to set the bag down. I said hello but received no response, so I hung up and quickly completed the delivery before hurrying back to my car. As I started my car and buckled up, I heard the front door of the house swing open. I looked over and saw a woman waving her arms in the air and running toward my car, screaming for me to wait. It was extremely bizarre. I was too frozen to respond. She dashed up to my window and banged on it, pleading with me to help her. I still had no idea what was going on, so I opened the window slightly and asked what she needed. She told me that her 3-year-old daughter was inside, struggling to breathe, and that I needed to help her. The woman began walking back up the driveway, pleading with me to come help her. Still in shock, I got out of my car and began to follow her, but as I did so, I noticed her becoming quieter and less panicked. I began to think more clearly now that the situation was less chaotic and unexpected, realizing how unusual this was. "Have you called 911 yet?" I inquired, stopping in the driveway. When she turned around, her tears and panic seemed to have disappeared. She stated that there was no time and resumed her obvious panic. It seemed more like a performance than genuine distress. I dashed back to my car as she screamed, even running down the driveway to try to open the passenger door. I restarted the car and reversed as she attempted to run in front of it to get to my side. Once I was clear, I put it in drive and drove around her. And the second I passed the house again, I noticed a large figure standing in the upstairs window, watching everything. As soon as I left the neighborhood, I called 911 and reported the address and situation. When I received a call back from the police, they informed me that the woman had a different story, claiming she had only come out to give me a cash tip. They also mentioned that she lived alone, with no record of any children or adults living with her. This only added to my horror at the situation, but after speaking with the officer again, it became clear that nothing could be done. There was no evidence to support either of our claims, and attempting to press charges would be pointless. Furthermore, the officer appeared tired and uninterested in dealing with anything, but I knew he was correct about my inability to do much, so it was left at that. In my gut, I knew she was trying to get me inside the house for sinister reasons, especially since she didn't have any children. What is the scariest part? After knowing everything, it was strange to see that person inside the house watching us and waiting for me to enter. I worked at a 24-hour fast food restaurant a few years ago while in college. The job was not fun or enjoyable in any way, and the majority of my coworkers were middle-aged people with no personality. I was doing school online, which gave me more time to work, so I was putting in at least 40 hours per week and even got promoted to shift lead after a few months. When I accepted the promotion, I had no idea that I was signing up to become a full-time employee, which meant that they could force me to work any shift, even if I was only a week in. They put me up overnight, and I couldn't argue. Overnights were a pain because I was always the only one there. So, if the drive-thru was backed up, then I'd be hustling non-stop without taking breaks. On the other hand, sometimes it would be completely dead, and I'd be standing around all night with my phone. This was one of those nights when I was sitting on a pile of boxes in the back of the kitchen, scrolling through my phone, trying to pass the time, when my headset rang to alert me that a customer had arrived at the drive-thru. I got up, went to the computer, and asked what they would do. I like to order. Nobody said anything, so I turned and looked up at the drive-thru camera, which showed an empty lane. There are no cars in the drive-thru or parking lot surrounding the restaurant. However, the system never falsely beeps like that. There was a slight storm outside, so I assumed it was a raindrop or a flash of light. You must have triggered the sensor somehow. I stayed by the drive-thru window for a few minutes before my headset beeped again. This time, I quickly checked the cameras and saw a man walking past the drive-thru lane. He was dressed in a thick hoodie and a face covering, but he quickly walked out of the camera's view. He couldn't have parked or walked anywhere else near the restaurant unless he walked on the side of the main road. I checked the cameras to see if he'd return, but after 10 minutes of nothing, I went back to my phone. I waited 15 minutes before getting another beat, and when I checked the cameras, I saw the same man, but this time he was standing in the drive-thru. "Lane, can I assist you, sir?" After a moment, he began to recite an order for a small meal. I was not supposed to serve people in the drive-thru unless they were in a vehicle, so I told him I couldn't take his order. He stood there, letting the rain soak him while staring at the screen and not speaking. I considered telling him to leave, but I didn't want to escalate the situation if it wasn't necessary, so I waited. After a minute, he began walking down the drive-thru lane toward the restaurant's window. I rushed over and closed the window, and the man appeared outside in an instant. He was still wearing his hood and mask, but he appeared to be in his late 40s, with long black hair and dead eyes. He watched me through the window and stood outside, as if waiting for me to speak to him. Something about his expression terrified me and prevented me from speaking. Then he softly said, "Open." I nervously replied no, and Justice remained where I was as the man continued to look at me. He asked again and knocked on the window, but after a few seconds he turned and walked away, leaving a loud scraping sound along the side of the building. I checked the cameras to make sure he left, and thankfully he did not return. During the next hour of my shift, however, I kept thinking about that scraping sound. I decided to take the trash to the dumpster and have a quick look. A long scratch on the side of the wall, under the drive-thru window, appeared to be caused by dragging a knife along the building. I called the cops, but the man couldn't be identified from the grainy camera footage, which was masked by the heavy rain and fog. The man never showed up, and I'll never know what he planned to do that night. But given that he was holding a knife, I assumed that if I had followed his orders and opened that window, it would have been the last thing I ever did.